When I was your age, we didn't have internets. We had to read books.
It is very common to mistakenly think that Genesis, the first book of the Bible, is an account of history. However, Genesis itself contains many clues that it is not history. It is a book of theology and story form, not a record of past events. Genesis was composed by compiling different stories and piecing them together. Many of the stories contradict each other, which is a clue to the reader that Genesis was not meant as a record of history. For example, there are two creation stories in Genesis. According to one, God created plants, then animals, then male and female humans. According to the other, God created a male human, then plants, then animals, then a female human. Genesis also contains two stories of how the town of Beersheba got its name. According to one, Beersheba was named after a peace treaty between Abraham and the Philistines during Abraham's lifetime. According to the other, Beersheba was named after a well that Isaac's servants dug after Abraham's death. Genesis also contains two stories of how Jacob acquired the name Israel. According to one, God gave Jacob the name Israel after wrestling with him. According to the other, God gave Jacob the name Israel sometime later without wrestling. According to one passage in Genesis, before the flood, God limited the human lifespan to 120 years. But according to other passages in Genesis, after the flood, several people lived far more than 120 years. In some cases, the compilers spliced two contradictory stories together so that bits of one alternated with bits of the other. Examples include the flood story and the story of Jacob's son Joseph. According to one flood story, God instructed Noah to take aboard the ark 2 of every kind of beast and 2 of every kind of bird, and Noah and his family entered the ark on the very day the flood began. According to the other flood story, God instructed Noah to take aboard the ark 7 of every kind of clean beast, 2 of every kind of unclean beast, and 7 of every kind of bird, and Noah and his family entered the ark 7 days before the flood began. According to one of the stories of Joseph, the people who sold Joseph to Potiphar were Midianites. According to the other, they were Ishmaelites. The contradictory stories show us that Genesis was not meant as a record of history. Because if two stories are contradictory, they can't both be historically accurate. Anachronisms in Genesis confirm that it is not a historical record. For example, Genesis includes domesticated camels in the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose lives the biblical timeline places in the 22nd through 17th centuries BC. But the archaeological record shows that the dromedary camel was not domesticated until the 10th century BC, and there were no Bactrian camels in the area before then. Another anachronism in Genesis is a Philistine city in Canaan in the story of Abraham, whose life the biblical timeline places in the 22nd through 20th centuries BC. The archaeological record shows that the Philistines did not settle in Canaan until the 12th century BC. In Genesis, the Pharaoh honors Joseph with a gold necklace and a public chariot ride in a story that's set in the 19th century BC. But the archaeological record shows that the Egyptian practice of honoring someone with a gold necklace and a public chariot ride did not arise until the 16th century BC. Genesis plus the next 4 books are together called the Pentateuch. Anachronisms and contradictory stories continue through all 5 books of the Pentateuch. Psalm 78 too sheds some light on this. It identifies the stories within the Pentateuch as mashal, a Hebrew word for literature in the category of parable, not history. The New Testament agrees. Several passages in the New Testament treat the Pentateuch stories as mashal. The early church, at first, continued the biblical teaching that the Pentateuch stories are not history. But in the 4th century, many theologians abandoned this teaching. The incorrect view of the Pentateuch as history then began to predominate. Unfortunately, many in the church currently continue to promote the incorrect view that Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch are books of history. The New Testament teaches that Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch, as well as other Old Testament scriptures, are God-breathed and are useful for teaching, reproof, correction, and training in righteousness. It does not teach that they are records of past events. Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch are not history books. They are books of theology, written in story form. An important consequence of this is that there is no conflict between the Bible and such findings of science as biological evolution and the passage of millions of years. Bible believers are therefore free to embrace these findings of science with a clear conscience.
Now go get me a rusty old Jeep and some banana cream pie.
I don't need no face.